tonight. I'm Robert Wright, visiting professor of science and religion here at Union Theological Seminary. And this is the third in a series of conversations this fall called Contentions, in which we contend with big questions and also sometimes contend with each other on stage. I imagine there may be a little of that tonight, given...
You're more contentious than me. So.
I was actually going to use the word ornery to describe you, but
okay.
Whatever. There will probably be some difference of opinion.
Can my chair be higher? No, I'm just joking.
I'm afraid not.
Okay.
We made it a low chair,
Yeah,
to lower your self-esteem.
I saw The Great Dictator.
The other thing we did, by the way, is, you know, there's a number of spaces here at Union where you can have these events. There's like a social hall next door and so on, but I wanted a space where you would feel at home.
Sure, and big enough, absolutely. And big enough to fit my ego.
Yeah,
right. Okay.
Well, there's that. So anyway, I want to say quickly, the next Contentions is December 8th with Francis Fukuyama. We're going to be discussing where history is headed, apocalypse, singularity, something in between. And as tonight, we will touch on philosophical and, at least glancingly, probably on some theological issues. Well, the title of tonight's conversation is Physics, Philosophy, and the New Atheism. That covers a lot of territory. I'm not sure we'll be able to do justice to those three subjects and the interconnections among them. But if there is one conversation partner I could have in hopes of doing justice to them, it would be Lawrence Krauss. As for the physics part, he is, of course, a physicist, cosmologist and theoretical physicist, and more specifically, foundation professor of the School of Earth and Space Exploration at Arizona State University and director of its Origins Project. He's taught at Yale and Case Western. In addition to all of his scientific accomplishments, he's known, I think, justifiably as a superb expositor of science for the layperson. Perhaps as most famously manifest in his best-selling book, The Physics of Star Trek. And if you've read Lawrence, you know it isn't just a matter of clear writing. He also has a gift for the apt metaphor and also a sense of humor, as I've discovered in our previous couple of conversations that we had on my website, Blogging Heads TV. This is our first time talking in person. His other books include...
You're so much more handsome in person, by the way. Sorry, go on.
That's so nice of you.
I just had to say.
And so are you, by the way.
Thank you.
Plus, your shoes are way better.
Yeah.
Than they were on Blogging Heads.
Yeah, absolutely. I was looking down at them a lot when I was doing the... No, anyway, go on.
Yeah, well, that explains it. Other books. A book on Richard Feynman called Quantum Man.
Yes.
A book called Hiding in the Mirror.
Yes.
And I'll get to the other one.
There's 10 of them. You'll never remember.
10?
Yeah, but it's
I
okay.
won't get to all of them.
You won't.
No, and neither will you.
You're going to get to the new one
time.
because you're going to bring up some nonsense associated with it.
This is true.
Okay.
This will be my focus. He's also done a lot of writing for esteemed periodicals such as the New York Times and so on about physics. So we got the physics part covered. As for the philosophy part, in Lawrence's most recent book, A Universe from Nothing, is that the name of it?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. He dares to tread on the turf of philosophers, and they have not all reacted warmly to that.
In fact, and this is an appropriate group to say that the philosophers have acted much more poorly than the theologians did.
Is that right?
Oh, yes.
Well,
they're much more sensitive. They're much more sensitive.
That just shows you that religion is a good thing, wouldn't you say?
Well, I think theologians are used to being trashed.
That's it. It could also be Christian humility, but you may be right. Anyway, the book, it created some intellectual tension with philosophers. As for the nature of the tension, I think you can get a clue from the subtitle. It is Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing. You may know that this is a long-standing conundrum. Philosophers for centuries have pondered the question of why there's something rather than nothing, haven't come up with an answer. Imagine their chagrin when they go to the bookstore and see Lawrence's book, and the subtitle is Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing, and more humiliatingly still, it's not by a philosopher, it's by a
that was
physicist.
the worst.
So we are going to be talking about that tonight, among other things. Okay, so there's the physics and the philosophy. As for the New Atheism part of the title of this conversation, Lawrence has been grouped by some with the New Atheists. Of course, the New Atheists are these atheists who gained prominence a little more than a decade ago, I guess, people like Sam Harris, the late Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins. And the reason they call them new atheists is at least in part because they are particularly militant, more so than...
I always wonder, good, now you explained, I never understood what new atheism was.
I will elaborate
I think
further.
it's a derogatory term to make it sound like neocon or something. There's no, it has no meaning whatsoever, as far as I can tell,
Well,
except as a derogatory, meaningless term.
Well,
I'm a very proud old atheist.
At the risk of suggesting that you have played a role in tarring them, you recently published a piece in the New Yorker called "All Scientists Should Be Militant Atheists."
Yes, and if one reads it instead of reading the
I would
title,
never go that far.
I know. I was going to say, well, a lot of people read the title and immediately tweeted. But the point of it was to make sort of tongue-in-cheek, point out that there are two things that are labeled. So I'm called a new atheist, which has no meaning, and a militant atheist, whatever. I don't know if that's someone who throws leaflets or something. And my point was that people are called militant atheists for nothing of the sort. But we'll get there if you want. I don't want to hijack that
we
yet.
will get everywhere.
Later I'll hijack that conversation.
Everything I've talked about, we will get to.
Okay. We hope. If I don't keep interrupting.
I was not going to say that.
Okay.
I was not going to say that.
I know.
Thank you for pointing out.
Yeah. Okay, there we go.
Truth. I actually was not sure whether you would call yourself a new atheist, and I guess you're a little ambivalent about that. But we will.
A little ambivalent. I just, I don't call myself anything, but I certainly wouldn't label myself by a meaningless label. Go on.
Okay.
Anyway.
Thank you. So this business of a kind of intellectual tension with philosophy that's kind of evident in Lawrence's latest book. You also have seen the work of some other new atheists. So Sam Harris wrote a book called The Moral Landscape, and the subtitle was How Science Can Determine Human Values. And I gather he suggested that what we now think of as ethical philosophy should actually just be a branch of science. And I guess philosophers can be excused, all told, for thinking that the people called new atheists view them with a certain disdain. And as if to remove all doubt about that, Richard Dawkins recently tweeted within the last few weeks, spent the evening with 4 philosophers trying to convince myself we need them.
Well, it showed he was open-minded.
Well, and then he says, surely we can all think clearly anyway, meaning that, without the help of philosophers. Then he says, then I remembered Twitter. So, in other words, he's saying, oh, I forgot. There are these people who need instruction on how to think clearly. There are all these people who criticize me on Twitter. So I guess the good news for philosophers is, although in Dawkins' view they have no valuable role in academia, they can make a living tutoring Twitter users. And there are a lot of Twitter users.
It's a challenge to get ideas in 140 characters.
I know. Well,
I used to think it was a waste of time.
You know what
but
the
now
challenge is to insult as many people as he insulted here in 140 characters.
Yeah, absolutely.
For me, insulting one person on Twitter is a challenge.
Yeah.
So anyway, these so-called new atheists have acquired, as you might now imagine, a reputation in some circles for a kind of intellectual arrogance. There's actually kind of a technical term for it. It's called scientism, is the allegation. So scientism is kind of failing to have due respect for the bounds of the authority of science, or an overly expansive conception.
Let me make another point. Let me interrupt you one more time.
Oh, sure.
Sure. It won't be the last. But
I'm starting to get that impression.
But yeah, science has no authority. No scientist of any who calls themselves scientists would argue authority is an anathema
there is
to
a
science.
realm.
Authority is an anathema to science.
Well, I think you would agree that the process of science, not individual science, is the most legitimate or reliable source of knowledge about the
It's the
physical
only
world.
source of knowledge.
Well, okay. So
Okay,
I would
let me
call
make
that
that clear.
authority. Being
Okay.
the only source, if somebody told me I was the only source of knowledge, I would feel that I had authority, but whatever.
No. No, because that's, you can question me on it. And try and prove me wrong. You won't, but you can try.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm looking forward to the attempt.
Sorry. The hardest
okay.
introduction you've ever... No, sorry, go on.
It's okay. I just need to go take a nap now.
If I didn't have respect for you, I wouldn't interrupt you.
I really feel the serotonin rising as you interrupt more and more often. Thank you for that. So, have I said everything I wanted to say in advance?
God knows.
That is true, probably. I just wanted to say that, you know, philosophers are not the only ones who feel kind of some heat from new atheists. Obviously, theologians do. We're going to be talking more tonight about philosophy than theology, unless you want to get into theology. I'm happy to talk a little about it.
Wherever you want to go.
But I do want to talk about religion eventually, because I do think the so-called new atheists, in appraising the role of religion in society, and of course their evaluation is not a flattering one of the role of religion in society, I do think they're guilty of, at a minimum, some less than rigorous thinking. So we'd like to talk about that. Why don't we start by getting into this new atheism? So you don't like the term, here's
No, why don't you stop using it?
why don't we just assume that every time I use it tonight,
you mean something else?
It's in quotes in the title of the...
yeah, I know it's in quotes,
yeah.
but it's like...
So imagine me going like this every time I say new atheism, but I'm going to say it so many times that I get tired if I actually
They
did
call
that. So
you a new philosopher. Okay.
So, as for the new atheism, what it has come to mean to people, and it is a term in currency, I think, if you ask what's distinctive about the new atheist, I think two things. First of all, it's true militant is too simple a term. They want to proselytize and convince other people to be atheists and convince religious people not to be religious. And that does distinguish them from at least many atheists in the past.
No, again, you say, well, you see, that's not true. I mean,
They don't?
what they want to do is convince people to think for themselves, that's all. And I think that's
Well, okay, they're unanimous in thinking that thinking for yourself will lead you to be an atheist if you think clearly.
will lead you to question religion, absolutely. Or that religion should be questioned like anything else.
They do believe that, yes.
And not believe it, it's a fact. But yeah, so, you know, once again, I just think religion should be questioned like anything else. There's nothing sacred.
You do.
And so, but then people label me as a new atheist, and so I don't. I was actually having lunch with my late friend Christopher Hitchens' wife, and she was pointing out that, you know, there's nothing new about atheism. There's new gods invented all the time, but atheism has been around forever.
No, there is something new. There is something that distinguishes the new atheist from some other atheists.
Yeah, I mean, the point is they're more vocal. They maybe reach a broader audience.
Okay, that's a difference.
Yeah, but, well...
So you just said there's nothing new. That's new. If it's a difference, it's new.
Well, I don't know.
But that's not the only thing.
I'm not even sure that that's true.
So that's not the only thing. Related to their desire to kind of, what I would call proselytize and convert people.
What does proselytize mean?
It means go out and spread the gospel, as opposed to just
There's
not
no
talking
gospel.
about
I mean, when I was on stage with
Lawrence,
hold on. I was with Richard in Australia, and these people said to me, how do you get people to follow you? And I don't want people to follow me.
Lawrence, if you're going to, like, every time I use a term...
Well, I thought philosophers were precise.
In an other than literal fashion, if you know, like gospel, everyone knowing that I'm using it ironically, because atheists are not really religious, so it's kind of ironic. If you're going to, like, you know, every time I do, we're literally going to get nowhere.
Well, I think it's important to, you know, you have some reputation as a thinker, and so it's important that to me that...
I'm warming up to you, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. It's important to me that people like you don't unknowingly misrepresent things, because other people might not think as deeply as you about these things, and therefore they might think the word proselytize means that we're proselytizing.
In the sense of, right, they might think that, and I think they might be right. But in any event, let me add one other feature. I think the reason, there is certainly a contrast with atheists who traditionally have just kind of thought, you know, peaceful coexistence, I don't believe in God, but whatever. That's not their attitude. And I think the reason, the expressed reason it's not their attitude, is that they think religion is a bad thing, an inherently bad thing.
On the whole, I think they think
well, the subtitle of Chris Hitchens' book was How Religion Poisons Everything.
Absolutely.
I'd call that a negative appraisal.
Christopher, definitely. But the point is there's a spectrum. But yeah, Christopher certainly, and I would generally tend to agree with that. But yeah, so I think that's true.
Poisons everything.
I think what's really a bad thing is treating religion different than anything else. That's, to me, that's why religion poisons everything, because it insists on some special place in the human condition. And that inherently makes it a bad thing.
Okay, but that's not, when we talk about people like Harris and Dawkins and Hitchens, that's not the extent of their belief that it's a negative thing. Their belief is more elaborate than that. They just
but you just put me in a whole pool of people.
I'm agnostic as to whether you're a new atheist or not, but you seem to have a certain amount in common with these people. And I'll ask you,
I do think on the whole religion poisons everything, yeah. Okay.
Everything.
On the whole.
Okay.
I mean, you know, that's you could tweet that, and therefore it's too simplistic.
So during the Civil Rights Movement, when Martin Luther King felt inspired by religion, and
we
many
had
other
that
people
discussion just today with that young man who's sitting over there when I was talking. I talked to a Columbia atheist group because they heard I was coming to see you, so they figured they'd piggyback. And absolutely, we're talking about why atheism might not be so prevalent among minorities. And one of the reasons is that historically in this country, certainly the movement against racism in this country was the institution of the church played a key role, and Martin Luther King is a good example. And so therefore, as a means of socially organizing against oppression, in recent times, the church has played a role. Of course, it played exactly the opposite role in earlier times in American history, where it was used to justify slavery. But in any case, it certainly, in the African-American community, played a key role during the 60s civil rights in helping organize, absolutely.
Well, there were also religious people involved in the abolition movement. But
yeah, of course, of course.
This is just my general point, is that you can find lots of good things associated with religion, done in the name of religion. You can find lots of bad things done in the name of religion.
You asked me on the whole.
And people who
So
right. But I mean, have you done the inventory? Have you made a serious effort to look at all the things that are done every day in the name of religion? And really
no, it's not important enough to do that. I have other more important things to do. But on the whole,
but you feel entitled to opine.
Well, what I do, what I do, and boy, this is getting a lot. I'm sorry, I started on. I got you really. You're
No.
But no. But here's the point. As I have become known and labeled by writing a book which simply asks the question, could you create a universe without God? Suddenly I'm a militant atheist because I asked the question. So then I come to see much more intimately. I become much more sympathetic with people like Richard Dawkins, in fact, because I come to see how you're labeled in a certain way just for raising questions. And then I come to see more deeply, as people write to me, the pervasively immoral nature of most religion in this country. It's become clearer and clearer to me as I go around that on the whole, it not only closes minds, it makes people. I get letters every day that I never got before, and those letters are from kids around the world, and also from people in small towns who tell me, and I'm just so happy I saw this, or I saw The Unbelievers, or I read your book, because I realized I'm not a bad person for asking these questions. I'm not evil. And that is, to me, something I really hadn't appreciated before, that religion has usurped this notion of morality, so that if you just saying, I don't buy it, automatically is equivalent to the saying, I'm not a good person. And that, to me, is the underlying most immoral aspect of religion. It tries to have a monopoly on morality and ethics, and it certainly shouldn't. But I mean, there's lots of studies that show it does. I don't know if in The Unbelievers, but you know of a study recently by a bunch of psychologists of students and adults in the United States and Canada that asked the question, who do you trust? And atheist, the word atheist, the lowest, on par with rapists. Okay? And that's just the way it is. And people were asked, what would be the characteristics that would most likely cause you not to vote for someone? Atheism. Infidelity, lying, financial impropriety, all of that was above being an atheist. So that, to me, because anything that suppresses open questioning is evil. And on average, apparently, the effect of religion having become ingrained in an institutional way in our society as being the owner of morality is evil. Now, I would say the same thing if right now, if it was anything else that claimed to be the owner of morality. People should think for themselves, and thinking for themselves is not evil. So that's when I say, I'm not talking about I'm not saying whether ISIS cuts people's heads off or whether it causes people to hate gays for absolutely no reason. What it does is it makes people feel guilty for thinking for themselves, and I can attest to that from just the vast and every single day. I'm amazed at that, and I hadn't appreciated that as an evil before I actually started getting labeled and people wrote to me.
I wouldn't say, I think you're overgeneralizing
more
than a little. I don't think it's inherent. First of all, we all, I mean, you and I both at least, favor people thinking for themselves. You're actually at a theological seminary full of people who are in some sense religious, who I think share that basic value. The fact that I'm here is testament to the fact that there are no litmus tests for actual conventional religious belief here.
Yeah, but there's, as you point out, there's a difference between theology and religion.
Gay rights as if religious people are inherently reactionary. Well, I don't think you'll find a single person in any way
affiliated with Union
people.
Did you hear me say people? I'm talking about
against gay rights.
Never said people. I'm talking about religion. Religion means an institutionalized framework in our society.
Right.
Okay, and so, and Richard has emphasized this. He doesn't want to make fun of people. He wants to make fun of ideas. And that's and that's important. So ridiculing religion is different than ridiculing religious people, because most people, first of all, including yourself in some ways, but most people, and you don't call yourself religious, but most people who call themselves religious aren't really religious in the sense that they accept the tenets of a specific religion. Most people who call themselves Christian don't buy into most of the garbage, the nonsense of the Christian. In fact, I've been on stage with people from the Vatican. I try to get them, do you believe in the virgin birth? Do you believe in the... They won't say, because they're also scientists, and they know it's kind of ridiculous. And so what they do, and in fact, Richard did this study, his foundation did this study in England, of people who checked on the census, they're Christian. So 55% of people, which was the lowest number in history in England, the last census said they were Christian. So they did a further study, and they questioned people who claimed the Christian box. They said, do you believe in the virgin birth? Do you believe in transubstantiation? Do you believe in this? No, 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 no. Why do you call yourself Christian? Because I like to think of myself as a good person. And I think most people call themselves Christians because they think if they don't, they'll be labeled as bad people. I think that the majority of people who call themselves Christians in this country wouldn't satisfy the Pope's definition of what a Christian is. And that includes this Pope.
You mentioned that Richard Dawkins doesn't like to ridicule individuals. Maybe this isn't ridiculing individuals, but when he tweets, all the world's Muslims have fewer Nobel Prizes than Trinity College, Cambridge.
That's great. You know, actually it's funny because the interesting thing is that if we talk about Universe from Nothing, it's interesting, there's only one that I know of particularly bad review of my book, and what it did was it criticized the afterword of my book, which was written by Richard Dawkins. So I'm always amazed when I get criticized for things Richard says, but Richard says some silly things.
You criticized the afterword you wrote for your book?
No, there was a review that basically focused on the afterword.
Well, let's talk about your book and then get back to religion per se. So tell me...
But Richard, you know, I think he provokes, and it's important. I think it takes,
that's productive? You think to insult all the world's Muslims is productive? It's making the world better and safer?
I think it can cause some people to think. I think it takes all types, 1,000 points of light, if you wish.
So you think that's...
No, I think it takes people like Richard. I'm a little funnier than Richard, so maybe that's a good thing. But I do think, look, someone was talking to me about an event I did in London where I debated an atheist, and I also required the room to be unsegregated because it was segregated by men and women. And it was a university, so I refused to speak if it was. And I said some things which would be considered offensive, but I did it to provoke thought. For example, the questioner was making the ridiculous statement that Islam encourages critical thinking. And it was a characteristic of the faith. So I said, really? Really? So you know, any question is okay? He said, yes. I said, okay. Is it okay to ask if Muhammad was a pedophile? Okay. Now that, I'm happy. I was worried that I would be, in certain places in the world where I would be killed immediately for that statement, and I was worried about it right there in London. But I knew that was an offensive statement to make, but what I was trying to do was to get people, it seems to me what you need to do is get all teaching of any sort, as a teacher, is to get people to confront their own misconceptions. So sometimes you say something that may seem as if it's offensive to get people to think about their own worldview. And that may be offensive, but also, as I told the kids today, Stephen Fry, offense is owned by the person who's offended. And so Stephen Fry, who's another new
Yeah,
atheist.
but people are offended, and we all, even you, refrain from saying things sometimes that will offend people.
Yeah, but the point is you decide how to respond. And so you can decide whether you're going to cut my head
I
off.
do not
or whether you're going to
insult ethnic groups.
No,
Let me finish.
Yeah, okay.
There are plenty of ethnic groups who are
It's not ethnic, it's a religion.
That's letting me finish.
Okay, but
Sociologists define religions as ethnic groups, okay? As included in the term ethnic group.
So Christianity is an ethnic group?
That is a common sociological view,
Well,
yes. I'm sorry to inform you.
That's a problem with sociology.
Well, I know that the new atheists in general, not that you're one of them, in making their various pronouncements and generalizations about religion, show no respect for the subtlety of inquiry that social scientists realize you have to exercise to say meaningful things about social phenomena. I'm aware of that.
So hold on, that's subtle? No, it's subtle to say that Christianity isn't an ethnic group, that it spans a...
I'm just saying that's their definition. We're wasting time. It's just a waste of time.
Well, okay, but
It
that's
really
what philosophy... Anyway, it doesn't matter. Okay. Okay, sorry. Calm down.
My point is, there are plenty of ethnic groups, religious, racial, plenty of other groups, demographic, gender, whatever, who are underrepresented in winning Nobel Prizes. And I think it's safe to say that some of them, Richard Dawkins would not say this about. I don't see the point of saying it about any of them, but it's certainly the case that the new atheists have gotten a reputation for being kind of anti-Muslim. And I just want to say, you know, Sam Harris says things and so on.
Well, Sam's been very vocal about it.
Yes.
Richard a little bit.
And I think it's unproductive. It's maybe worse than unproductive to be gratuitously offensive in this way.
I agree with you generally. To be gratuitously offensive is, well, it's often unproductive, but sometimes it serves a role of, sometimes you look, as I've often said as a teacher, if you want, the biggest mistake any teacher makes is to assume their students are interested in what they have to say. Okay, because then you've lost them. What you have to do, and you as a teacher, you probably learned that a lot.
Sadly,
so,
learned it this week.
And so what you have to do is you have to say, what are they interested in? And let me go to them and talk in terms of things that they're interested in so that they can be interested in what I have to say. But it's not true. It's true for car salesmen, radio hosts, writers, everyone. But so that's one way to reach people. But another way to reach people is to say something that appears so offensive that it causes people to, well, there are two reactions you can have. You can just be disgusted, or you can say, how could someone say that? Or, you know, that's an interesting statement, but it really offends me, so let me think of why it offends me. So I can understand doing it. I don't think it's not my style as a matter of practice, but I certainly think it's one way of raising the issue. For example, let me give you an example of something I said that's offensive to some people. I said, on the whole, teaching religion to children is child abuse. Okay, some people were offended by that statement, and we can go into why I said that statement. But then they point out, well, why did you say that? I said, well, if I hadn't said that, you wouldn't even know what you wouldn't have heard what I was talking about before. It raised the profile of that discussion I was having because I said something provocative. Now, that provocative thing, provocation and offense are slightly different, but I'm sure every time I say something provocative, I also say something offensive to some people. Okay. That's their problem.
Speaking of putting things in a provocative way that succeeds in getting attention, there are people who have, you mentioned, we wanted to get your book, your latest book. There are people who have said that the subtitle, Why There's Something Rather Than Nothing, is false advertising. So let's get into that discussion. Well, first of all, let me try to pithily summarize what I think is part of your argument, and then you can correct me if I've got it wrong, which I may well. But part of your argument is this idea that I gather there are these things called, well, first of all, there are these things called fields in physics, electromagnetic field, but there are also these things called quantum fields, relativistic quantum fields, and these quantum fields can assume various states, and the states kind of correspond to, in a certain sense, kind of how many, or particles, in other words, I guess talking about fields is in a way seen as a more fundamental way of talking about what is sometimes talked about as particles. Anyway, there is something called a vacuum state that a quantum field can assume, which corresponds to like 0 particles.
You make it much more complicated than it has to be.
Okay, but let me finish, and I think it's intelligible, and if it's wrong, you can tell me.
It's wrong.
Okay, good. And the idea is that these quantum states are unstable, so they tend to, or sometimes transition to other states that correspond to actual kind of particles. Okay? And that is, and you see something like that as explaining the long-standing question of why there's something rather than nothing.
Okay, well, no, so that's, first, as I made it pretty clear, I thought in the introduction of my book, that the first thing about the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is it's not a good question. Like many philosophical and religious questions. It's just not a good question. Every why question presumes purpose. Whenever we say why, we really mean how. So I put that question in there to provoke, to say, what does this question really mean? Why is there something rather than nothing? Well, if you think there's a reason, then there's a purpose. But then what if there isn't any purpose? So when you ask, why does the heart pump? You don't really why. You mean, how does it pump? Why do we have 2 legs? You don't really mean that.
There is a why answer in that case because it's functional. So you can say, you know.
No, it's eventually how, right? No, because the how wasn't created with a purpose. It has a function.
Natural selection does.
So you ask, how does the part cause people to cause blood to be circulated and cause the body to be oxygenated? Ultimately, all why questions are how questions. As I point out, the why questions are, you know, your kids always ask why, and eventually you say, because, go to bed. And so I phrase that question first to point out that, you know, sometimes questions may be bad questions. In particular, what science really does, and this is what really offended some people, is cause us to redefine the meaning of certain words. But that is, in fact, called learning. Okay? And so science may say, you know, this concept which we thought was reasonable may not be reasonable. Take, for example, causality, which is a certainly reasonable concept, and the foundation of modern physics. Well, people often ask me, what came before the Big Bang? Well, the answer may be, it may not be a good question, because, as I'll get to, space and time could have popped into existence, because space and time are tied together by general relativity, okay? They're inextricably tied together. So if you create space, you create time. So it could be that if our space was created by, say, quantum fluctuation or something like that, that there was no time before. So the question, what was before, is just not a good question. Now that means we can't use traditional techniques of even physics to try and address it. We may have to change our ideas of what are good questions. Just like quantum mechanics has caused us to change our ideas of what separation means, what distinct means. You know, things here and things there, if they're entangled in the classical world, are separate objects, and if I affect something here and instantaneously affect something there, it appears as if something happens faster in light. In quantum mechanics, that's not true. So we have to change our concepts. We have to be very careful. One of the points of my book was, what is nothing? So when you say, why is there something rather than nothing, you have to define what you mean by something and nothing. And as you pointed out clearly, that means understanding from a physical perspective what those concepts are. And the thing that I tried to say, which also appeared to offend some people, is that nothing is a physical concept. It's not a philosophical one. Namely, if nothing is the opposite of something, if that's really true, if nothing is the opposite of something, which maybe you could argue isn't the case, but let's accept for the moment that's the case, then something is clearly a physical concept. So we really, in order to understand what nothing is, which is the absence of something, we better understand what something is. And that means we've got to do science. And so I tried to lead people through that. Now, it is true, what I pointed out is there's 3 kinds of nothing. I mean, the interesting thing to me is people who say, why is there something rather than nothing? And who object
I'm going to ask you to cut to the chase pretty quickly.
Okay, I will. Well, it depends if you want me to actually explain what I'm talking about. But no, but hold on. So the nothing. So when you ask the question, what is something? Why is there something rather than nothing? You have to find what nothing is. And I would argue most people, specifically when I think of the theological basis of that question, don't actually define what they mean by nothing. They mean the Bible as often defines nothing as this vast empty space, which I point out is certainly unstable. But I said that's a simple kind of nothing. And then you talk about quantum fields. Well, that's another kind of nothing. But my point was...
But that's not a kind of nothing. And let's focus on this because that's a criticism. No, let's get there. Let's
the
get
criticism
there. I know
of
why
people,
you don't want to go there.
No, no.
Let's get there.
Yeah, let's get there. No, I really want to get there because... Hold on. You haven't let me get to the real nothing.
You just talk for 5 minutes. Give me a break.
No, no, the real nothing is nothing.
They're going to leave without knowing what the critique of your book is if you continue to filibuster.
Let me say what I said, and then you can critique it.
Okay, if you'll let me critique it.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. The final and most important thing is the kind of nothing I'm talking about is no space, no time. Everything we see, everything we experience did not exist. The space in which we live, the particles in that space, the time in which we live did not exist. Then it began to exist. Now, whether you like calling that nothing or not is a semantic question that doesn't interest me. The point I was trying to address is how can you get a universe full of 100 billion stars in each of 100 billion galaxies from absolutely nothing, no space, no time, no particles. Now, whether you decide that the absence of everything we see, including the space in which we exist, is nothing, is something I personally don't care about.
Okay, but that is, and will you give me several minutes? Seriously?
Yeah, you can talk as long as you want.
Thank you. But that is, the question you're now dismissing as uninteresting to you is the question you actually purported to address in the book. In the beginning of the book, you say, for centuries, theologians and philosophers have wrangled with this question, why is there something rather than nothing? I think we can shed light on that. So I perhaps naively assumed, when you referred to the question that philosophers and theologians have wrestled with, that you were talking about the question that theologians and philosophers have actually wrestled with. They are interested in the question of how something in the sense of physical laws, physical stuff, space-time, whatever, came out of nothing, nothing, nothing.
What do you mean?
And the problem... And the problem, which has been...
Define nothing.
Well, it means, for one thing, the absence of physical law.
Great. I said that's a possibility. Our laws may come...
It's a possibility, but what you actually purport to be able to show through physics...
I didn't claim to show any of it. I just said it's plausible.
What you showed is that something that can kind of be called nothing can generate something. But let me finish. The thing that you say is kind of like nothing. Actually, you're assuming the existence of physical laws at that point.
No.
And well, how does a quantum field get to something without some sort of physical law?
There's no quantum field because there was nothing, and there was no quantum fields existing before our universe existed.
I think we're conflating two parts of your argument. Maybe there is and you know, you and I had this discussion on Blogging Heads, and you were saying at that point, well, in the beginning there was law, and I was saying, well, no, that's not going to satisfy a theologian. They want to know how before there was law, or a philosopher, before there was law.
What if before isn't a good question?
Let me finish.
Okay.
I said, that's not going to satisfy them. They want to know how it is that before there was law, okay? That's what they mean by nothing. Before there was law, and you said, well, at that point you said, well, that's not what I mean. Now,
no, I did say, in fact, if you read my book, first of all, my role is not to satisfy theologians or, you know, because...
No, but if you purport to address the question they're asking, now let me finish. You said you let me finish.
Even I described having no physical law whatsoever.
So after the conversation I had with you on Blogging Heads, where I said, but wait, you're starting with a law? That's not good enough for the philosophers. Then the review of your book appeared in the New York Times Book Review by David Albert, philosopher.
It wasn't a review of my book. It was a review of the book he wished I'd written. Yeah,
well,
go on.
He, unlike me, is a philosopher of physics.
Yeah.
And he pointed out that you weren't just assuming the existence of law, but that any quantum field, even one that's described as a vacuum, is a physical phenomenon. So
yeah, but he obviously hadn't read the book. Because I didn't talk about it. I mean, that was one part of it.
You didn't talk about quantum fields.
He didn't review anything I actually said in the book.
What is the argument?
I would have given it a C+ if I was an English professor.
So what is the argument he missed as to how, well, I don't think we have to go there, because you've already said
if space and time don't exist, there are no quantum fields.
And there are no laws.
And I even said, in every different universe in a multiverse, the physical laws can be different. If there are an infinite number of physical laws, there are no laws at all.
I'm talking about a time when there are no laws.
Or every law. I don't think of it as a different. If anything goes, then there are no laws.
Well, anyway, what philosophers mean is no laws, nothing that's in any sense physical stuff. Are you showing us how you get from there to here?
Yeah.
Do you purport to show
Yeah,
us that?
yeah. In the sense, let me try and walk you through an example. So look at that light. Okay, so you can see the light because there are photons coming from that light, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. But the photons didn't exist. They weren't sitting in the atom before they were emitted, when the electrons changed energy levels. They didn't exist at all. They didn't exist. Those photons weren't there. Suddenly they exist.
Right.
Now, that doesn't bother you. A photon from nothing doesn't bother you. But what I'm telling you is that you can get a universe from nothing, and that bothers you. What?
No,
No, there was no photons. Hold on. The absence of photons is no photons. I call that nothing. In photon land, there are no photons, and then there's suddenly photons. So the absence of photons, I would call nothing. Now, so if I suddenly have photons come into exist from no photons, it's a really amazing thing. And I guess when I say I'm providing insight into the issue, I don't say I solve the question. I say science changes our thinking and causes us to rethink some of those fundamental questions, like why is there something rather than nothing, and realize that maybe that's not such a good question, because the distinction between something and nothing in science is not so great. And in fact, in certain kinds of science, including quantum field theory, nothing, which means no particles, no radiation, is completely indistinguishable from a state with lots of particles and lots of radiation. But it's even more, because if you make space and time dynamical, then universes can come where there were no universes before. Now, if something existed outside those universes, that is an interesting question, and it's a turtles on turtles question. You can ask, and we don't have an answer to this, you can say, did our universe come into existence spontaneously when there was really nothing, no space, no time, and nothing else existing elsewhere? Or did it come into existence in the midst of a multiverse in which other things may have already pre-existed, and may have pre-existed for an eternal time? Those are interesting questions. But it adds you'll forgive me, but I think the real philosophical and theological question is that it makes it appear as if you need a divinity, that seems to violate the laws of physics, is how can you have all this stuff if there wasn't stuff in the first place? And the thing I wanted to celebrate was that you can get all this stuff from no stuff without any supernatural shenanigans. And that, to me, is amazing. And that's the question I wanted to address. Okay.
But you did not show how you get there from nothingness in the sense that philosophers have always meant the term. And that's why you started out rightly by saying,
I don't care what philosophers always mean the term. I defined what I meant by nothing. I defined my terms. They don't.
Didn't mean what they've always meant.
I don't define in terms of what they mean. I defined what I wrote a book. Right. Why is there something rather than nothing?
There is a sense of the word nothing as defined by you, in which you have shown how something can arise for it. It's just not the sense that philosophers have always meant.
Fine.
Which is fine. Okay, so we agree on that.
Yeah, I don't know what philosophers are. I would claim I've yet to meet a philosopher who's defined what they've always meant.
Well, they definitely...
No, when it comes to nothing, I define at least my terms. No one's ever countered me. You know what they define nothing as? That from which only God can create something.
No,
well,
no,
that's,
philosophers don't.
Not theologians. Philosophers then, what philosophers do is define things in terms of other things, but classical concepts go out the window. Before may not mean anything. The term before the Big Bang, what it came from. In fact, why is there something rather than nothing may really be a bad question, because it implies a causal process that may not have existed. And we have to accept that these possibilities can arise, and that physics tells us they can arise, and realize that it may change the meaning of the question, and the question may not be a productive question. But it may not satisfy philosophers, but to say that's not a productive question, but that wasn't my intent. My intent was neither to satisfy them or upset them.
You actually do start off the book purporting to address that question, but whatever.
Yeah, I think I do.
The thing, I think, to understand about this question and purporting to answer it is that the question as asked is imponderable. And that's kind of what it was famous for.
What is imponderable?
It's not like philosophers really thought that we were going to find out, because it's an inherently unanswerable question for the following reason. It's like, if you say, why is there something rather than nothing, and by nothing you mean no physical laws, whatever, the only kind of answer that's intelligible to the human mind that somebody can provide does involve asserting some kind of being or physical system or law. So you have your version of that. They may say it's God, whoever, but whatever anybody says, if they say this is what turned nothing into something, the answer is, well, where did this thing come from? And so it's
I
in
didn't
the
say there's
structure
anything
of
in
the
turn.
question that it can't,
That's the point, is you assume agency. To assume agency is wrong. In quantum mechanics, things just happen.
Sure.
There's no agency. There's no reason. There's no reason why that electron, there's no physical reason I or anyone else can determine why a given electron emits a photon. There's no reason whatsoever. It just does. Now, the point, it amazes me when you say that this, so the central question of philosophy is a question which is unanswerable. Well, I come from a field where we actually try and ask questions we can answer. That's the difference between physics and philosophy. One makes progress, one doesn't.
Has anybody ever said that was the central question of philosophy, aside from you?
Well, you just said. You
I
said
it was
earlier.
the central question
Well, you
of
said it was an eternal
imponderable.
No, but before that you said it was you know, we'll have to rewind the video, but I think you tried to make it appear as if it was somehow an important question.
Okay.
Was it? Is it an important question?
It's an interesting question, but it's unanswerable by virtue of its structure and its nature. It's an example of the limits of the human mind.
But what physics does is take questions that are unanswerable and turn them into questions that you can try and achieve an answer to.
Well, if it has,
even philosophy,
to change the question, that's not progress.
Philosophy does that too. I'm sorry. I think philosophy takes questions that are poorly framed. I mean, look, I make fun. People claim I make fun of philosophy, but philosophy is central. We all do philosophy. What philosophy does, by rational and clear and critical thinking, is to try and take vague questions and turn them into precise questions, which you can decide upon whether they're answerable or not, and then you can proceed by reason. And in my case, you know, I don't distinguish between philosophy and science. Science is just empirical evidence, because that's the only, in my opinion, source of knowledge, supplemented by reason, and they come together. Now, some people call the reason philosophy and the empirical evidence science, but to me, the process of science is to take empirical evidence, use rational thinking, and combine the two. And that's what philosophy does in all of its best cases. Philosophy bases itself on evidence, tries to establish extremely precise, critical, logical steps of thinking to determine what questions are reasonable, how to frame questions that are reasonable, what lines of thought might be productive, and you know, so that's sort of science. I don't think there's any distinction between those two.
So we agree I'm right.
Yeah.
Okay. But we do agree, I think, you're not answering the question that philosophers
No, we don't agree. Well, I don't know what philosophers are asking. Sorry. I can't, if I'm not asking a question that's vague and ill-defined, you're right. I'm sorry.
They're asking how you get from nothing, nothing, nothing.
I mean nothing.
No
No laws, no space, no time, no particles. Now, that may not be nothing. Fine. But at least I defined it. But I'm just a physicist, so that means I'm inherently kind of a heathen. I mean, I just tried to define what I say. And I think if you read my book, I very clearly define what I mean, and I never claim to describe anything that I don't define. Sorry. Go on.
Okay. So we'll before long get to Q&A. Let me ask you a couple of things. Just there's a phrase that you say, if you could just briefly tell me what you mean by this, that you're recently. The more we learn about the workings of the universe, the more purposeless it seems. Do you mean the more we understand about just the machinery, why things happen?
There's no evidence that there's any purpose behind the universe, yeah.
Okay. But I mean...
Does that mean there's no purpose? I don't claim there isn't.
But I mean, if you think of it as like a deistic purpose, you know, like a God who wound the thing up, then further exploration of the mechanics don't really shed a lot of further light, right?
All I said what I mean. There's no evidence of purpose in the universe. Does that mean there's no purpose? Absolutely not. It just means there's no evidence for purpose. So, but you know, it seems to me, you know, as scientists, we don't say, what we can say is something's likely or not likely. Mm-hmm. And we can even sometimes quantify the level of likeliness. That's all we can do. And so you can say, you know, are there evidence of unicorns? Okay?
Well,
and I can't prove there aren't unicorns, but I can say there's no evidence for unicorns. It's highly unlikely there are unicorns.
What would evidence of purpose look like?
Okay, if I looked up tonight on the sky, if it were clear, mm-hmm. and the sky rearranged itself and said in ancient Aramaic or, you know, English, because mm-hmm. apparently God speaks English,
okay.
I am here. You know, that'd be pretty convincing to me that there's something going on.
You mean a specific theistic interventionist purpose? That's what you're not talking about purpose generically.
Or if there was evidence to me that somehow the direction of dynamics in the universe had any specific direction towards something I would call good or complexity or something.
Well,
if there's any
actually-
direction, if it looks like things are designed in any way, then I would say purpose, and there's no evidence of design.
Actually, if you look at evolution, and I want to emphasize, I'm talking about a strictly mechanistic view of evolution by natural selection, period.
Sure.
If you look at evolution and the subsequent kind of cultural evolution it gives rise to in the human species, there are people, including me, who believe, first of all, that actually the evolution of intelligent life was fairly likely. Once you've got intelligent life, the trajectory we've seen is
You think
fairly
it's really
likely.
likely?
Yeah, I do. And I'm not alone. I mean,
Based on what evidence?
read a chapter in my book, Non-Zero.
No,
read the whole thing.
I mean, it seems to me we have a sample of one, so I think it's...
Well, okay,
yeah.
generically,
Took 4 billion years to do it, too.
Generically, the number of thresholds that have to be passed to get you to intelligent life that have been passed multiple times independently. So like multicellular life has been invented many times. You know, the things that we think of as, you know, helping us evolve toward intelligence, like grasping appendages, there's a whole lot of these things.
It's a fascinating question, because if the dinosaurs hadn't been killed 6,000 years ago, I was just talking to my daughter about this today.
Conjectural.
Would there have been intelligent reptiles? It's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't know the answer.
That part is just 100% conjecture. Anyway, it's an argument. There are evolutionary biologists who agree with me and some who don't, but let me just...
It's a fascinating question. I just don't think we know enough to know the answer.
So if evolution naturally carries us to higher levels of sentience, first of all, given the fact that subjective experience, so far as I can tell, is the source of meaning on this planet, it's because animals can experience pain and pleasure that life has meaning and love and so on.
So hold on. I'm sorry to interrupt.
That's the middle of the sentence.
I'm not sorry to interrupt.
Please, let me finish the sentence,
Okay.
Lawrence. Then what that means is that if you accept the premise of directionality, again, read my book Non-Zero or other things. Dan Dennett agrees with me on the likeliness of intelligent life, by the way.
But you said directionality. You make it say, evolution has no natural direction. Evolution has no natural direction at all. That's what upsets me, because what you're doing is promulgating a myth about evolution. It has no directionality.
It's a complicated
It depends on natural selection.
Yes, it does.
So, in fact, if there were different conditions on the Earth, then the direction of evolution would be anti-intelligence. Because if the conditions of the Earth were such that only single-celled life could exist, then natural selection would, anytime multicellular life arose, it would die. So, I mean, to argue that that evolution has some direction towards complexity or intelligence is to vastly misrepresent what I think evolution is now. Now, you know, you'll have to get Richard Dawkins to see. I mean, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but it just depends on conditions of natural selection. Yeah. On Earth, conditions were such that intelligence arose, but there could have been vastly different conditions, which would ensure that evolution would imply that intelligence would never arise.
So you say, you know, I've thought about this. I've argued with people. I've written about it. People look. There's an argument going on.
Well, I think I said what I meant, and you have to ask me where I'm wrong.
And anyway, let me finish the thought. If you agree, and I made this, the idea that there's a kind of directionality, if a mechanistic one, in biological evolution and in cultural evolution is when I made a book length in Non-Zero. Read it. If you disagree, get back to me.
Well, I gave you my argument. You have to tell me what's wrong with it. I mean,
we don't have all night, and it's a complicated question. I'm just trying to give people the big picture.
If the temperatures were 1,000 degrees, you'd find that natural selection would not
obviously.
Okay, well, that's
many inhospitable
Then it doesn't have a directionality in that case.
Well,
or the directionality is quite different.
If life can't go anywhere, it won't go anywhere. You know.
No, you could imagine you could imagine life forms existing, but complex multicellular life forms based on biochemistry of carbon would certainly not arise. So, as a physical fact, whatever forms of natural selection might result in a self-replicating entity that utilized energy from the environment would not...
For the moment, I'm talking about evolution on this planet. We don't know how many planets are like this. I'm talking about evolution on this planet. Let me just finish the thought. If you accept an argument that I've made at length, that biological evolution is likely to lead to greater complexity, ultimately intelligence, intelligent life, for reasons I could argue, and don't have time to, is likely to carry social evolution. We'll argue about it over dinner. I'm happy to.
Yeah, we will.
Social evolution to higher and higher levels. You get a couple of things. First of all, natural selection is like a machine for generating more meaning in the sense of more conscious life, capable of things like love. Secondly,
Wow.
interestingly, and this is, by the way,
It's wonderful how from wrong premises you can rise.
I just realized this is going to masterfully bring us back to where we kind of started.
Okay.
And cultural evolution, for intelligible reasons, tends to carry, but mainly by virtue of technological evolution, tends to carry society to higher and higher levels, hunter-gatherer, chieftain, city-state, and so on. Now, let me just finish. Now we are on the verge of a global civilization. My own view is that closing the deal, cementing social cohesion at the global level, is going to call for further moral progress on the part of humans. We may fail, but that will involve, among other things, getting better at looking things from the point of view of other people. And now is where it masterfully comes back to the point of origin. I think it's going to involve not gratuitously insulting large groups of people, especially when right-wing politicians are telling us we're in a clash of civilizations. And we know for a fact that some of these people are causing trouble and are terrorists, are motivated by the sense that the West disrespects them and has no respect for their civilization. So
right,
wasn't that amazing? Wasn't that amazing?
Yeah, we agree, because I think the worst gratuitously insulting people is to tell people that you're absolutely right because your God is right and theirs wrong. So I think you're absolutely right. No, you're not saying it.
I'm not asking for that.
No, but I think you're absolutely right. The best way we'll come to be moral is by getting rid of all organized religions, which would claim that they have a monopoly on truth, and then we'll have a much better world. Absolutely.
You know, I can imagine a perfectly satisfactory world with no religion. I don't think that if you really want to get rid of it in a reasonably peaceful way, the fastest way is to go around grabbing people and saying, don't you understand, your God doesn't exist.
Oh, I think that's probably true. I think the way to do it, if you care, I mean, it's not my purpose, but one way to do it is to get people so excited about reality that they don't need the myths. And that's what I try and do. The real world is so much more exciting than the myths that I try and point out to people how exciting the real world is, and then maybe they can find even spiritual wonder and joy from just looking at a Hubble Space Telescope picture. And so I think you're absolutely right. I don't think the best way to lead to enlightenment is to tell people they're stupid. That's probably true.
Tell your friends Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. Anyway, we close on a note of concord. I also am in favor of wonder, joy, and all the good things you mentioned. Mm-hmm. So we can go to Q&A now.
Yeah. So another Q&A.
Sir, in the front row.
Yeah.
By the way, are you John Horgan, the famous science writer?
As if there's no fix. Is the fix in here? You know.
I actually read Lawrence's book. So the question I have for you is about...
You need a microphone, John.
You need a microphone.
The question I have for you is about certain trends in modern physics. The popularity of string theory, which was hard to test 25, 30 years ago when it first emerged. It looks even harder to test now. Mm-hmm. Also, multiverse theories are very popular. Those also look possibly never really testable.
No, I think they're much easier to test now than when I wrote my book 5 years ago.
Okay, so that was the question, is whether from a marketing point of view, if you're trying to present science as a great alternative to religion, whether it's a bad idea for some very prominent scientists to be trafficking in theories that are extremely speculative and criticized even by physicists and cosmologists.
Well, I think scientists always have a problem when they overreach. Because it comes, and so that's not true just for scientists, true for anyone, because it comes back to bite you. As you're no doubt aware, I was called a critic of string theory. I'm not a critic of string theory. I'm a critic of the hyperbole in the public presentation of string theory. So, as I like to say, some of my best students are string theorists. I wouldn't want my daughter to marry one, but some of them. And by that I mean, so string theory. And I wrote a whole book about its motivation. There are really good motivations for doing string theory. What the problem was when people presented it as something that had done something, and it hadn't, and from a physics perspective, it's an incredibly interesting and exciting idea, but it hasn't yet achieved anything that the other aspects of science that we should celebrate have achieved. There's a tremendous amount we know about the world. And I think, as I wrote in that book or another book, it's a shame that more people know what superstrings are than superconductivity, which actually is kind of fascinating. So absolutely, I would agree that we should never promote something as more than it is. And the science books I have the hardest problem are when people present their pet theories as if there's something profound, and I think that's irresponsible on the whole. And it's not, but I'm not castigating any particular author. There's some I'm castigating, others aren't. There's some people who find it fascinating, and they think there's a progression. And as I say, one of my books, Hiding in the Mirror, is some sense about string theory, about the fascination with extra dimensions, while pointing out there's no evidence whatsoever there are extra dimensions. But why are we fascinated by those things? And as I said, I will say this, my friend Brian Greene, long ago when I first said it, got very upset on the stage in New York when I first said it, which is that calling string theory a theory is a disservice to evolution. Because string theory isn't a theory. But Brian says that now. He's come around. It's not a theory. You know, it's very good for him for a while, but I think it's really important. It's not a theory, and we do a disservice to science by lumping it in to quantum theory or general relativity as a theory. So yeah, I think it is, but I don't think that's generic on the whole. And by the way, multiverses are, the big difference, of course, between string theory and religion. So people say string theory is religion, and there's a huge difference. String theory is well motivated. I mean, there's a real set of rational reasons for exploring it. There's no rational reason for inventing these myths. There was irrational reasons when 2,000 years ago people didn't have scientific explanations of anything. But so string theory is well motivated. But when it comes to multiverses, in fact, I argued, and in fact it could be, that had a certain result been clearly correct, namely the discovery of gravitational waves that were in inflation, it could have given unambiguous indirect evidence for the existence of other universes. In exactly the same ways that we understood the existence of atoms well before we could ever see atoms. So I was quite excited by that possibility. It turns out that result may not be correct, but it could be in the next few years that we will be able to test the ideas of evolution, come down with a mathematical model which we can test in 50 different ways, where the 51st prediction of that model is that there must be other universes. And I find that fascinating and empirically interesting. It turns metaphysics into physics, as far as I'm concerned.
Other questions in the very back there, or almost very back, with the Metallica T-shirt on? I always call on people with Metallica T-shirts on.
I appreciate that. I'm glad that you kind of reconcile science and philosophy in a way. I find that it's a common attitude among many scientists that philosophy is kind of outmoded because of the advances that science has made over the past century or so.
In certain areas, I agree with them. Philosophy of physics is outmoded in the sense, and this probably upsets David Albert, but there are certain areas of science. See, philosophy is the birth of science. So what philosophy does is begin to formulate questions which can lead to productive answers. And so the natural philosophy was well defined as natural philosophy. When it came to physics, those questions were important. But where physics is now, the philosophical questions are just, they don't drive the field. That's not a pejorative statement. It's a fact. It's just nothing any philosopher does right now affects what's happening at the forefront of physics. And that's just the way it is. That doesn't mean those questions aren't of interest to philosophers, but they're not of interest to physicists. One of the reasons most physicists can't spell philosophy.
Okay, well, I guess my issue was the disconnect.
But in neuroscience, by the way, there's an area where my friend Dan Dennett works, where we understand much less, and philosophers can play a much more useful role in framing those questions. So, you know, I mean, I'm often stereotyped as hating philosophy because I have to make jokes, but there are certain areas where it's incredibly important and useful to frame questions. And we all do philosophy.
Exactly.
Whenever so anyway, I don't need to tell you that. Okay.
But yeah, essentially, I believe there's a huge disconnect between scientific discourse and the vast majority of people on Earth. And
that's one of the reasons why I do what I do.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons is that scientists often, in fundamental ways, fail to understand the human condition in ways that to somebody who studies philosophy is pretty self-evident. For instance, Stephen Hawking made this statement that if we were to make contact with extraterrestrials, it would lead to a lot of atheists. And that to me was extremely...
It would lead to what?
A lot of people becoming atheists.
He also said we shouldn't make contact with extraterrestrials, by the way. He likes to make a lot of statements. They all make news.
But to me, that was incredibly naive because I could easily imagine going back a millennium and saying, well, perhaps if we discovered that the earth was round, a lot of people would be atheists. Obviously didn't happen. If we discovered that the earth was not the center of the universe, it would make a lot of people atheists. Didn't happen. So my question is essentially...
Yeah, I think you're right there. I mean, I think it would cause people to, it would change the dialogue, but I suspect the people who need religion would not stop needing religion.
Yeah, same here. But my question is, how do you kind of bridge that gap? Because a big criticism of Spinoza, which to me is one of the greatest atheists, whether he directly identified as that or not, is that the criticism that he failed to understand the role that religion had in people's lives, that it fulfilled so many needs that humanity has that a purely rational scientific view just doesn't feel. It may feel it for you or I, but it doesn't really feel that need for the vast majority of people. So how do you then you bridge that gap between what humans kind of need on a deeply, perhaps unconscious level and what science offers?
Okay,
Well,
thank you.
to be honest, no, it's a good question.
No,
I can answer
I said thank you.
Oh, I thought you meant
That's what I say to good questions. To bad questions, I say that's a bad question.
Oh, I see. Sometimes, okay. Sometimes I thought people say thank you when you think someone made a statement and you want to move on. Okay. But that was a question. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Anyway, so there's a matter, it's just a matter of communication. So, it is true that it is hard for people for whom the things that religion provides to many people doesn't provide it to them, for them to empathize. Okay, so it's empathy. But I think so what we have to do is be honest about it. We have to be honest, recognize that there are things that religion provides, ask why it provides those things, and ask the question, is that the only way to provide those things? And I think that's a much more productive way of dealing with it. I happen to, and I'll be upfront about that. My big point is that I think that there's nothing that religion provides that a real, honest view of the world couldn't provide under the right conditions. Solace, consolation, group. We could all have quantum mechanics classes every Sunday, and although my preference would be rock concerts, so I think that, people tell me religion brings people together every Sunday, and of course it does. It builds a sense of community, but there are other ways of building a sense of community. And what about a sense of meaning? Well, the fact that the universe has no meaning doesn't mean you don't have any meaning, okay? You make your own meaning, and to me that's much more profoundly more energizing than the statement that someone else defines your meaning. You defining your meaning makes every action you do more precious. And so I could be a preacher and argue those kind of things, which I do sometimes. But so I think you can frame those arguments in a way that at least cause people to think about that. And again, all I can do is cause people to think. They have to decide for themselves whether that works. But you're absolutely right that many of the ways we speak, and I don't want to generalize scientists in general, appear to be alienating, appear to not understand, and are patronizing, appear to suggest that people who are religious are stupid. That's an unfortunate thing that we should avoid.
Okay, can I just say one thing on that point? I do think among some prominent atheists, I won't call them new atheists, there's a tendency, I get the sense that these are people who have no trouble with life. They're happy and they have no trouble living with a completely secular worldview, and that's fine. I do think there are people who have some trouble with life. I actually count myself among them. I don't find life that easy. Some people help themselves through life with things like prayer or meditation or whatever. My own inclination is to leave them to their own devices. I think some people, I've seen cases where people who otherwise might have died from substance abuse problems seem to have been saved by prayer and things like that. So that's one reason I'm just not disdainful of anyone who's practicing any religious tradition and not bothering anybody else. My own view is that, can I just finish? I'll tell you when I'm done. My own view is that you should judge people by their behavior and not their beliefs, and we would all get along a lot better if we just held people accountable for their behavior. And that's enough. The world is complicated enough. And finally, let me finish. I want to say a word about theology, because I think sometimes you get, when quote, new atheists are ridiculing theology, they have a kind of arguably antiquated notion of what it is, or at least a selective notion. So they kind of have in mind kind of fundamentalist theology or whatever. And I just want to say, I mean, we're at Union Theological Seminary, and I don't know how many people know, but Union was kind of the epicenter of so-called liberal theology in the 20th century. Liberal meaning not necessarily politically liberal, although there turns out to be a correlation between being a liberal theologian and being politically liberal, but actually meaning, you know, kind of involving liberal interpretations of Scripture, of whatever. And at some point, theology becomes so liberal that the difference between it and philosophy is not all that clear. I mean, Paul Tillich was here at Union, and he defined God as the ground of being. Now, you know, he was accused of being an atheist. Maybe he was. And it could be it could be that what some theologians are actually involved in is, you know, you once asked me on Blogging Heads, well, what knowledge, what has theology added to the knowledge about the world? And I don't really
No one's given me an answer to that
I don't think that's what theology is about. I think you're misunderstanding. There may be kinds of theology that are, but I think certainly modern liberal theology is about helping people find a source of moral orientation and meaning that is actually, in many cases, not incompatible with science. That's what a certain amount of liberal theology has been about, is a response to the scientific revolution. That's why God
Why is it called theology,
is defined in increasingly non-anthropomorphic terms. Well, it gets back to the fact that...
I mean, theology. Why is it called philosophy? Or, I mean, I don't... I mean, with all deference to this beautiful building, I don't think any self-respecting university should have a theology department because it hasn't contributed anything as a field to knowledge. Philosophy has, psychology has, but no one has given me an answer yet for, in the last 500 years, any bit of knowledge that theology has given.
As I said, I don't think that's what a lot of modern
I think it's
theology
philosophy.
is about.
It's philosophy.
Well, I'm saying that the line is kind of blurring, and in a certain but I think theology is maybe more mindful of helping people preserve any valuable sources of meaning and moral orientation that they have. And maybe all it is a graceful transition to an ultimately atheistic world. I don't know. What I do know is that there are people who need to have a spiritual life. I say let them have it.
Well, I have a spiritual life.
I mean let them have it.
My spirituality is better because mine's related to reality.
Yeah,
but
but what I'm saying is...
I don't want to usurp spirituality as if it's not somehow related, as if it's different.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason look, besides enjoying pushing your buttons and...
look, can I just pay you a compliment? You're really good at it.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, you make my wife look like a toad.
I think it's important for people like me sometimes to not give way when people use colloquial definitions that permeate a falsehood or propagate one. And I think that the notion that spirituality is somehow separate from science is a notion that I disagree with incredibly. So that's why I interrupt, because I think if I don't, it gives it and that's why I try. I think there are terms that are used that people like me need to say, hold on, all the time, because if we don't and make pests of ourselves, then they just. So anyway, that's part of the reason. Besides the fact I really do enjoy pushing your buttons, but I do agree with you about beliefs and actions, and I've written that. And in fact, a good friend of mine.
People account for their behavior and let them believe what they want, as long as they're not hurting anybody?
except for the following. And I've had this dialogue with Noam Chomsky, and you can watch it on TV to see it, because we did it at my institute in Arizona. We've done it privately. He said to me, I don't care what people believe, it's what they do that counts. And that's true. But the important thing is what people believe affects what they do. And to not recognize that is, if every man was an island, to use that thing, then I wouldn't care what people believe. But what people believe, if they're parents, or if they're teachers, or if they're heads of organizations, impacts what they do. And therefore, you have to ask, therefore beliefs are of some concern, because they do produce actions.
Right. And if the fact that beliefs do influence behavior is the reason you think a religion generically should be criticized, then I would say, again, that rests on the premise that religion is on balance bad, which in turn is a proposition that not a single so-called new atheist has treated with anywhere near the rigor that a question like that deserves.
Well,
they just make
we're always
facile
accused of
assertions
not
and
treating
point to
things
the
with
worst
rigor.
things in the world associated with religion. And I welcome the moment when.
Well, I think Steve Pinker addressed the question very well in his book. The Better Angels of Our Nature. No, do you not think Steve Pinker did a really good, detailed job looking at this question in the Better Angels of Our Nature? Which I think was a very rigorous and interesting book.
And by the way, I mean, he's pointing to a kind of moral progress through history, which to some people would suggest the possibility of purpose if realized through a strictly materialistic process.
He points out that the science and the Enlightenment produced that, is what he argues.
Well,
and
no, that's
rational
not incompatible.
thinking.
That's not incompatible, because these are all part of a material process.
But you know what? I don't think it's that religion should be criticized. It's the point is that religion can be criticized. That's the point.
It certainly can be criticized. We agree there.
Are you? Yeah.
I'm flattered they want to hear me.
Okay.
Well, you haven't said anything yet. We're reserving judgment.
Talking about the new atheists, if you, speaking for myself, and a lot of atheists that I know, and there's some people I see from around here who I know from the atheist movement, the job is not to try to convince religious people that they shouldn't be religious, because that's impossible. I mean, if you live in a literate society like ours, and you reach the age of 21, and you believe in God, then you're not thinking rationally. It's like a 4-year-old believes in Santa Claus. A 10-year-old believing in Santa Claus, you'd say, what the hell's with this kid? Because it's obvious. So the reason why we have an atheist movement is not to change those people, because you give them a logical argument, their thinking is not logical or rational. It's a matter of faith. It's an emotional thing. And sometimes very intelligent people can be religious. And atheists can be very stupid sometimes. But not in...
Present company excluded.
This way. He does push buttons.
Okay.
No, so where was? Oh yeah. So
you were going to ask a question, I think.
Well, I was going to say something. See your reaction to it. What we're doing is trying to protect atheists. Atheists are a despised group. For example, if I have on my car "Jesus saves" or some other claptrap, don't think anything of it. But if I have on my car, "There is no God, I am an atheist," I'm worried about my car getting scratched.
Well, that's wrong and bad, and I certainly, and I recognize, I think it's true. I mean, I was certainly in a minority in high school in Texas in my belief system, you might say. And I was much closer here into the spectrum than almost everyone else in my high school, so I know that. And I also know, and this is something I learned when I debated Sam Harris in Los Angeles. Richard Dawkins was there, and I realized, I mean, he has such an ardent following. And by the way, we didn't have time to get into certain properties of religious movements that arguably the New Ages have, but very ardent following. And I realized that one thing that motivates it is there are people who feel that they were really damaged by a religious upbringing, and I don't doubt that that happens. Now, maybe that in some cases these are parents who would have damaged them with any, belief system, whatever. But I don't doubt that that happens, and it certainly should not be the case that you have to hang your head in shame for being an atheist. It certainly shouldn't be the case that you have to hang your head in shame for arguing for atheism. What's that?
Or even being a Republican, say.
Well, I think you've gone too far now.
Yeah, that's right.
There are some things that should be stigmatized. So I mean, don't get me wrong. I just think that the kind of the attitude we see on the part of some new atheists is, in important respects, counterproductive and rests on simple-minded premises about whether religion is generically, good or bad.
Well, hold on. But of course, that's a vast generalization, which I'm sure which is, and also a facile one, which I know you're totally opposed to. You want rigorous thought. But to say atheism is based on this,
no, I said some. What I meant to say was some new atheists are making manifestly facile assertions about religion generally because they don't back it up with rigorous argument.
Well, some may be, but some don't.
And some may be Sam Harris, and some may be the late Chris Hitchens. And some may be Richard Dawkins.
Well, Christopher's book is backed up with a great deal. I mean, it's a remarkable.
I read it and debated him. I have a different view.
Okay.
No point in
now, I hope you won't say later that you debated me, because first of all, I don't enter debates in general. I have dialogues and discussions. And I don't think this was a debate, it was a discussion.
No, I don't recall
So-
any divergences of opinion.
Okay, so we didn't have a debate, but in any case, I think Christopher's book is a masterpiece in many ways, and an enlightening one, or was, and he was a good friend, so I'm biased, well, I actually became a good friend because of that book, so maybe I'm not so biased. But I think the point, it's not just so much defending atheism, I think you need to just make it normal. And that's, I think, the main purpose of these standard bearers, if you wish. And you mentioned movement. I'm not part of a movement. I don't like to be part of anything that will have me as a member, right? And so,
Groucho Marx.
absolutely. And so, I don't think of some movement. All I'm trying to do, and I spend most of my time doing other things. But when I'm called upon, is to just make it normal. Is to point out that you can, that you can be a thinking, reasonable person, and moreover, that there are interesting questions that should cause you to doubt your faith. In fact, I wrote a piece, which you didn't quote, which I said, I think the purpose of teaching, and we should, in every high school in this country, encourage children to doubt their faith. Because just like we should encourage them to doubt absolutely everything else, they should teach them to doubt what their parents tell them, doubt what their teachers tell them, and doubt, because that is a central part of becoming a thinking person.
Well, I certainly think we should teach science. I think if we specifically encourage them every day in school to doubt their parents, you may see the public funding of public education begin to dry up.
Yeah.
But whatever you think will work. So I think, first of all, we should feel flattered that as many people have stuck around as
it's right.
have. I should take. Let's quickly. If somebody can ask a question in like 30 seconds or less, vows to be able to, then let's pick on them and just choose two of them, right? And for convenience, let's make them in the same place. Quick questions, ask them in succession, and then we'll get a response to both of them and then adjourn right here, these two.
Okay.
The young man.
Well, that's not fair.
What's not fair?
Well, I mean, let's ask each person to have a question and answer it, because whenever two people ask things in succession, one person's question gets subsumed in my experience.
Right, but like I'm imagining the average length of a Lawrence Krauss answer, and I'm doing the math.
I know yours seemed much longer to me, but I think it's because, anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah.
So my question is two parts and addressed towards Robert. Firstly, I believe you have some misconceptions about evolution. Doesn't natural selection simply favor the organisms which are most successful at replicating under their given habitat, and that's not necessarily towards multicellular life or complexity? And lastly, repeating a word over and over again more loudly isn't a definition for it, so could you please define nothing?
Okay. And then the...
Those are questions I asked him, too, so it's good. Maybe you'll get an answer.
Hi. Dr. Krauss, would you say that science basically undercuts not only religion, but a lot of the secular people who say, oh, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, and they believe in things like past lives, psychic powers, and stuff like that? Like I saw Sean Carroll at the Amazing Meeting a couple years ago, and he just basically threw cold water on all that, and it was...
Well, science throws cold water on those things which disagree with empirical evidence, and which are unfounded on the basis of, which make claims which aren't supported by empirical evidence, and that includes all of that nonsense. And I wrote a book a long time about that. But it doesn't cast water on spirituality. As I say, what I'd like to do is subsume it. I mean, the spirituality of science is profoundly spiritual. And so I think we make a mistake, people make a mistake by claiming that science has no ethics, no spirituality, no all of the things that they claim science isn't. We at our peril accept, and that's why I interrupt when people start to say those things. Anyway, you can answer the first question.
Okay, on nothing, I mean, I think the way a modern philosopher would describe it for purposes of addressing the why is there something around a nothing question would be something like, no physical laws, nothing that can be described as a physical stuff or physical system, including relativistic quantum fields with some kind of vacuum, nothing, no space-time. Now, that's kind of hard to imagine, which is kind of the point. But
I wrote a book about it.
But it seems conceivable that it could have been that way. I mean, there is stuff here, and the question is, why is there stuff? And I think some of them mean it as why, some of them may mean it as how. But if you mean it as how, I think the point is, well, if you start positing some sequence by which nothing in that sense becomes something, you'll find you can't do it. Because there's no laws, no physical stuff to operate on, and so you can speculate, oh, it could arise spontaneously. But that spontaneous is another word for we don't have any idea what we're talking about.
That's not, that's another word for people who don't understand quantum mechanics. Okay, I'm serious. The point, the point is various classical notions of logic and meaning are changed, but they're changed because not because we wanted to change them, because the universe forced us to change them. And so you shouldn't presume that those ancient, or colloquial, common sense notions are true. Common sense is not a good guide. It's a good guide maybe to, you think, direct human experience, but it's not a good guide to how the universe works.
Well, anyway, I mean, my final word on that is when somebody says something could have arisen from that true nothingness I just described spontaneously, we don't have time to adjudicate this. Just sounds like total hand-waving.
Well, then you'd be...
It could have. I guess it could have.
Well, hold on. Then to the young man's second question. There are a lot of people who say, in fact, Ben Carson, the ultimate ignorant person, said...
No, wait.
I mean, the person who doesn't understand basics of science.
There's so much competition for that title in the Republican field alone.
No, but if I had to pick the person who was the most ignorant about science in that Republican field, it would be Ben Carson. But anyway, what he would say, he said exactly the same thing you just said about evolution. I can't see how you can create life from no life. I can't see how you can create complex human beings. He said if you can understand how you can create the human mind from evolution, that's something
you know what his problem is? You know what his problem is?
He used that same outmoded argument.
I can explain how evolution works by reference to scientific laws operating on physical systems.
But you can't
explain how the beta brain evolved. If you imagine true nothingness, you can't explain it that way.
Hold on. We don't know. No. But there's a big point. No one knows right now
we
the
may be
steps by
testing
which
your
the human brain evolved. But we all recognize the plausibility of it evolving. And this young man just pointed out, the steps are quite simple, and they don't have any directionality, but they happen to allow you to understand how a complex system could form in the presence of pressure, of environmental pressures.
So then let me answer his second question about directionality in evolution. This is a question on which reasonable people disagree. The late William Hamilton, who came up with the theory of kin selection of William-Mark theory, I'm sure you've heard of it, he agreed with me that intelligent life was likely. Stephen Jay Gould disagreed. I've critiqued Stephen Jay Gould's ideas.
You can't argue that something's reasonable because someone else agreed with you. That's an argument that, unfortunately, I hear too often from philosophers. They quote other philosophers.
I'm not, but since I'm not a professional evolutionary biologist, I can see someone, wondering, well, who the hell are you to say? I just want to say there are credentialed, serious people who agree there's a division of opinion. If you ask, how could it have a direction if what natural selection is about is kind of getting genes in the next generation? Yes, you're right. Those traits that survive are those most conducive to the replication of the genes underlying the traits. That's all that's going on. Now, it turns out that, first of all, as an empirical matter, as an observed matter, life, evolution on this planet at least, is this incredibly creative thing that invents all of these things multiple times independently. But beyond that, we understand some of the dynamics by which complexity grows. For example, and this is ignored, Jerry Coyne, a so-called new atheist, in his latest book gets into this argument, and it seems like he hasn't read anything since Steve Gould wrote 20 years ago, because a good example of something Coyne ignores is the existence of so-called arms races, like within species, and to some extent, probably a lesser extent, between species. But that dynamic puts upward pressure on behavioral complexity through a known mechanism of natural selection that everyone knows about. So there are other reasons to think that in general, when you're in a competitive situation, not just with other species, but with other members of your own species, to get genes in the next generation, behavioral flexibility often pays off.
Although cockroaches will be around when we're gone.
Behavioral flexibility is intelligence.
No, but I think, there's certain things that it's also true that certain systems, like cockroaches, there's pressures that on some systems that produce change, other systems reinforce certain.
But let's be clear. If the premise is that intelligent life was likely to evolve, the claim isn't that all species will grow in complexity, although all species have grown in net complexity since the beginning of time, biological time. It is just that at the outer envelope of complexity, if you look at the most complex species on the planet at any time, that tends to, if fitfully, get higher. And it's an established fact in the fossil record that that outer envelope has, in fact, gotten higher. We are at the outer envelope. I think I've given you a sense for the kinds of arguments that come into play.
Although it's quite likely just temporarily. But again, you're making, I think your point is a good one. Let me just say that.
Oh,
okay?
I think we're going to end right here.
But hold on.
Thank you.
But hold on. No,
Thank you, Lawrence. Let's give Lawrence a big hand.
But the outer envelope goes in both directions because evolution explores the entire allowed phase space. But the important point to realize is you're also making the assumption that we're somehow the end point. It's quite likely.
No.
Well, hold on. It's quite likely that intelligence is a temporary thing. And therefore, in the long run, if the Earth survives up to the 2 billion years before it's about 1,000 degrees, then it's quite likely, it's quite possible. I don't say quite likely. It's a possibility which seems to me as likely as any other possibility that intelligence will end, and there'll still be happily life on Earth. And in that case, I don't see how you can say natural selection will inevitably produce higher complexity because the life forms that may survive in the long run are less complex.
If your friends continue to insult entire ethnic groups, intelligence may indeed turn out to be a temporary phenomenon, but I hope not, and I hope the human endeavor survives. So listen, Lawrence, we're going to close on a note of concord, friendship, and amity.
Yes.
And I just want to say that you have been everything I hoped you would be. You've been provocative, articulate, entertaining, and above all, wrong. So let's give him a big hand.
I'm gracious enough to give you a glass here.